everybody. Welcome to Off Panel, a weekly interview podcast about all things comics brought to you by Sketch.com. I'm your host, David Harper, and this week's podcast is a special one. It's the show's annual Three Themes podcast, as we look back on 2023 in comics from the perspective of three different guests in three very different roles in comics. My guests are retailer Katie Pryde from Portland, Oregon's Eisner-winning Books with Pictures, comics journalist Heidi MacDonald from The Beat, and writer-artist Jamal Igle. And each will be joining me to talk about a single theme from the year that stood out the most to them about the year in comics from their specific role. The hope is this will result in an episode that gives listeners real insight into the year that was in comics from the inside, helping us all better understand what's going on in comics in a much better way in the process. That's what we'll be doing today, and it all starts with Katie Pryde, who walks me through a critical year in comics retail. Here we go. Okay, so I'm here with Katie Pryde from Portland, Oregon's Books with Pictures for the comics retail section of this episode, and we're going to be talking about the thing that defined the year in comics retail from your perspective. More specifically, I think we're going to be talking about how this was a year of transition for the direct market. You said you had some visual ideas as to like what this theme was. When you think of this year for comics retail, what do you think of?
First off, David, I'm so glad to be here. Thank you for having me on. And I imagine... Well, when there is an avalanche, and then after the avalanche, the sort of moment of crashing and momentum stops, but there's still a lot of potential energy in that avalanche. It's not stable, it's not finished, it's just sort of balanced into place. And there's sort of a sense of any amount of poking it is going to create more motion. Or after a very large earthquake, when you've experienced the earthquake, and the earthquake was, maybe 2 minutes of rolling, shaking, jangling, but then you have weeks of feeling aftershocks. And every time you feel an aftershock, it's not just that it is disruptive, it's that it's sort of re-traumatizing and that you are wondering how big this one is going to be and does it echo the previous earthquake? But what it really is a sort of settling into place. So where I feel this year of comics retail has been not the earthquake, but the aftershocks and the settling into place, and specifically the sense of anxiety that comes with not knowing how big each transition is going to be. So that is how I feel about comics retail this year.
Can I add on top of your visual metaphor?
Absolutely.
So I was in a 7.1 earthquake 5 years ago here in Anchorage, Alaska, and I was out getting a coffee at this kind of grocery store type place that has a really good coffee shop in it. And when that happened, I came back in and like everything was on the ground. Everything was on the ground naturally, because that's what happens when you go through a 7.1 earthquake. There's just a lot of stuff falls over. And so it seems to me that it's like, so the earthquake happened. Now it's like, you and the rest of the retail are figuring out where should we shelve things? Where should everything be together? Like, what does the next thing look like? Is that what it is? Or do you think we're still in that and those aftershocks could result in more changes?
So it's, I don't believe we're quite out of shoes to drop yet, but I think that we are now at a place where we can sort of see. So I was actually a foundational memory for me is the Loma Prieta earthquake. So I do this is a thing that lives in my head. That was whatever it was, 7.4 or something. So similar to your Anchorage earthquake. And I really specifically want to key on the emotional experience of there was that big earthquake. Everything is on the floor and things keep shaking a little.
Yeah.
So you don't feel necessarily confident in reshelving or, putting your china back in the cabinet yet, because whatever survived, it doesn't feel safe yet.
When do you think the earthquake, continue the metaphor, when do you think the earthquake hit? Like what started us on this path?
I mean, I do think that the pandemic broadly, but more specifically, I think that the earthquake was probably Diamond stopping distribution early in the pandemic, which I continue to say I think was the right call. But that's neither here nor there. It was a massive disruption. And following Diamond's shutdown, DC moving distribution, and I believe that that's when the dominoes started to fall. followed by not only the fracturing of distribution, but the concomitant fracturing of data that happened with the fracturing of distribution. You knew I was going to talk about data.
Oh, yeah.
But additionally, the supply chain challenges in manga were happening at the same time for the same set of pandemic reasons. So really this moment where the flow of retail customer traffic kind of got very weird at the same time that distribution got very disrupted, at the same time that supply chain got very disrupted. I think we're still experiencing the fallout of all of that. And I don't think that we're going to be done. I think that the shoes that we are waiting to drop at this point are what is ultimately going to happen with diamond distribution, what is ultimately going to happen with the publishers that remain exclusive to diamond distribution, and really in the US, specifically, what is the economic picture going forward? Because I really think that it's important to remember that, comics retail is a part of consumer retail, which is as a category experiencing a lot of disruption still.
I actually have a piece that's going up today that it doesn't connect to this, but it kind of alludes to some of the things you're talking about. I think one of the things that people underrate when they talk about the comics retail in 2023 conversation is it's really easy to be like, this is happening because comics are bad. Yeah. This is happening because of this. And I'm like, this is happening because of like a million different things, some of which have nothing to do with comic books. Some of which are just, the price point going up could be problematic if the economy is also a struggle at the same time and the perception of the economy is a struggle. And so all these things kind of connect together. These are like all of the aftershocks happening after the earthquake. They keep happening over and over, and it's really tough for anyone to settle because there's so many factors to consider. It's not as easy as one thing as much as people want to act like it is.
Yeah, absolutely that. I get very cranky when people knock the quality of current comic books. I think that mostly the people who knock the quality of comic books right now are not reading them. And that there is a sort of broad old man yells at cloud of it must be something that's happening in the books, not that I'm looking at them or have any like attachment to them, or I'm not reading them because they're not what they used to be, where in fact, like, comics right now are amazing. Like I really have no patience for the argument that comics are sort of broadly bad or of lesser quality than there were 10, 20, 60 years ago. Comics are fantastic right now.
Yeah.
But I think that the broad economic picture is not just challenging, but also strange. And so right now in the US, there is a frustration of the things that we use as broad economic indicators are going up, are improved. And you would hope that that meant that the sort of consumer experience of retail was in a lifting state, but it's not. Small business is still really, really, really having a hard time. I do think we're going to lose comic shops right now. I don't think it's because comics are bad. I think it's because the overall picture of trying to run brick and mortar retail is kind of dire at the moment. And it's one of those moments where I think that what we're going to see is it's a test of how much patience you have, how much tolerance you have for risk, how much credit you have, how deep your supporters' pockets are. Like, this is one of those times where people are going to reach the limits of just sort of what they can financially, how long they can financially wait for things to get better. And I do think we're going to see that going into 2024. And I think it's really a shame, but it's not because of any one thing. It's because a whole mix of things. But I think that the factor I really want to underline is the exhaustion and frankly trauma in comic shop owners, so that there is this feeling of everything is just one more thing. Everything is piling on. We are doing more work for less profit. And so so the were you at sorry, changing topic, not really. Were you at New York Comic Con? Did
Yeah.
you see my keynote speech there?
I was in the room, but I couldn't hear it. The audio was very tough.
That's exciting because there were also no monitors, so I had no idea how my audio sounded on stage either.
I think it sounded fine in the front. In the front, I think it sounded fine. In the back, apparently, if you were at the tables, it was fine, but in the back, it was very tough.
Okay. So the talk I gave at New York Comic Con to the room of professionals was using the Mr. Miracle issue where Barda and Scott are breaking into the throne room. And so it is this series of images of them in dire peril. They are walking on tightropes and they are swimming through sea monsters and they are dodging lasers and they are doing all these heisty things. And what they're doing while they're engaging in great peril is discussing remodeling the apartment, ultimately because Barda needs to tell Scott she's pregnant. But the metaphor that I was working with is that the discussion around how to remodel the apartment is one of those everyday things like running a brick and mortar store that is about receiving shipments and talking to customers and making sure you have dog treats stocked for the dogs who come in, like everyday stuff that we know how to do, that we're good at, that comic book retailers are good at. But the context of it feels like every room has a new dire risk in it.
Right.
You open up the data file and the data is absolutely unusable. And so today you are not working with customers. You are spending the entire day cleaning a data file or whatever. And that when comics publishers and distributors give us a new task. So if somebody says, oh, here's a marketing ploy, and all it requires is that comics retailers do XYZ to use the marketing ploy, you're not just going to someone who's sitting on their couch reading comic books and asking them to do a task. You are going to someone who is already on a tightrope and asking them to do one more task. And
Right.
That's really, I think, the emotional experience of retailers right now is this sense of, I am already spinning as many plates as I can spin. And when you bring me a new challenge, you're not bringing it to a neutral state. You are bringing it to an extremely stressed state.
Yeah. One where you're going to get really mad at that plate.
You're going to get really mad at that plate. You're probably going to drop a different plate. That other plate you dropped might have been important, or you might judge it as disproportionately important because you are so stressed.
Right. I guess, going into all this, one of the tricky things is like, I think when we talk about all this, there's this general conversation about things are bad. And I'm curious as to how you think this is affecting that space, because it's like, while some shops are struggling, and as you're saying, there could be closures and everything like that, I think to some degree, it's even worse is the fact that there are so many plates that it's like causing that stress and that uncertainty and all that stuff, which is amplifying the feelings people have about the experience, which kind of makes the whole experience even worse, which is part of the reason why the conversation is as it is. How do you think this is affecting the space? Are there any real specific ways you can point to?
I'm going to name names. I love and respect, of course, all of my retail colleagues. But I do think that the predominant pessimism of big voices in the industry, like Brian Hibbs, like Phil Boyle, who have big microphones and have been declaring the end of comics for the last 25 years, continue to declare the end of comics. And I think it does stress everybody else out. I think it does. It is baffling to me that particular tone of voice has not yet created a sense of crying wolf.
I think it has to some degree.
There is a sense of, if comics are always on the verge of dying, why should we listen to you this time?
Right.
That is hard to balance against, no, for real, things are very hard right now. I think that there are specific things that comics retail really does need from publishers and distributors. And I think that it's very challenging to mix that up with these voices that say everything has been dying for 25 years or longer.
Are there specific things though that you can point to that kind of started with the earthquake, where you're like, this is one of the aftershocks that I'm really feeling?
I mean, I have spent my last 2 years, I think, coming up on 3 years, really deeply focused on comics metadata challenges. And that is a thing that I think is just an inordinate stressor to comics retailers, whether they know it or not. I think that the inability to, so basically the very short rundown on what's happening in comics metadata is that there used to be an ad hoc norm, which was that publishers sent their data to Diamond. Diamond went through a cleaning and normalizing process with the data that they got from publishers, which they did not tell anyone they did. So Diamond added series codes if series codes were missing and normalized titles. And it wasn't great, but it was far more than they told publishers they were doing. And it was far more than any retailer knew they were doing. They were doing a lot of work with that data.
And it was consistent.
And it was consistent because they were the only source.
Right.
So it was consistent just by virtue of it being only Diamond doing this work. When distribution fractured to Lunar, to whatever the other thing was, and then eventually to Penguin Random House, when distribution fractured, publishers kept sending the same data, but they were then sending it to 4 and then 3, and it's a whole thing. But they were then sending it to different distributors. Each distributor had a different set of things that they did to the data they received. Those things were not normalized in any way. Diamond did not have a clear set of practices about what they did to data that other distributors could adopt. Also, it is the strict policy of Penguin Random House that they don't do anything to data that they receive. The data is the publishers. It is sacrosanct as the publishers. And there is no agreed on set of norms or standards for what comics metadata should look like. So there was no way for retailers to say, hey, your data is bad, wrong, unusable. This leads to like one of the things that nobody knew until it happened is that DC Comics and Marvel Comics have never put series codes on trade paperbacks. Even if a trade paperback is sequential, the ability to subscribe a customer to a paperback series from DC or Marvel has always been because of data added by Diamond, not because of data that the publishers put on those titles.
So really quick, series code for listeners is basically the identifier that says this is Immortal X-Men or this is X-Men Red. And like that way, it's like if the series code is on the trade, if you subscribe to the first one, you'll automatically be subscribed to all of them, right?
So single issues have those. Single issues have always had those. And it's assumed that one of the things that consumers of comic books do is go into a store and say, I would like to buy every She-Hulk from 1 forward. And the mechanism by which we do that is the series code. Trade paperbacks, it has become a norm that you can also say, you know what, I am a She-Hulk reader, but I only want to read She-Hulk in paperbacks, not interested in the single issues, but I want the paperbacks to go on my shelf. Please subscribe me to that like you would to a single issue comic book. It turns out that the only reason we've been able to do that for the past decade or more is because Diamond had been adding those codes. So when those publishers left Diamond, we suddenly could not subscribe customers to those books because the codes disappeared. The codes disappeared because Penguin Random House and Lunar were not adding them. The publishers didn't know that that was a thing because they didn't know, because they hadn't been doing it in the first place and it had always been fine. The distributors didn't know that that was a thing because Diamond didn't say, oh, hey, now that you're poaching our business, you should remember to add these. And so it just disappeared.
Right.
And We didn't know how Diamond had been generating those codes. So we didn't know how to create a system going forward that would generate the same set of codes, similar codes, analogous codes. So anyway, I have been working on this project called the Comet Standard, the comics metadata standard. You can sign up for updates right now, I think, at comet.org or something like that. The white paper is coming in January, February of next year. I am currently in the midst of writing it, but it's been a project with all of the distributors in the meetings, all of the publishers in the meetings, VPs from DC, Marvel, Image, Viz, all the big dogs in the room, and initially very suspicious of each other, but by the end of our process, really genuinely collaborating with each other. There was a moment where someone from DC introduced a problem that they had been having, and someone from Marvel said, hey, that's a problem we had too. Here's how we fixed it. And I have never been so proud in my whole life as seeing those people genuinely engage with each other in a collaborative sense to solve problems that we all have. And I think the other big thing that we see when this data fractured is that we also lost any kind of sell-through data, any kind of collected sales data. Nobody knows how comics are selling right now because we don't have the data anymore.
And sell-throughs to customers, though, right?
Sell-throughs to customers. We've never had it reliably. Sell-in is from the publisher, is from the distributors, and we've lost that too.
Right.
So even Marvel right now doesn't know how well Marvel comics sell.
Exciting.
And so until we get the metadata cleaned and standardized, again, but maybe better than before, we can't start figuring out, hey, how do we get these critical data streams about sales back into place? Because we don't even know what the product is in a metadata sense.
Right. It's so crazy.
It's utterly wild.
I know. It's. I did a piece on my site with Brian Garside where I talked to him about it, and it was just like learning about it is just so bewildering. I mean, you can see how it happens, but it's just kind of like one of those things where it's like, why was it necessary? But, you know, comics. You know, just a couple more questions to wrap up. I did want to ask specifically about how is all of this being reflected in what you're seeing at Books with Pictures? Because I know, you know, for example, you were having a particularly slow stretch a while back where you encouraged people to buy something from the shop if they wanted to help out. And that was something you could do because you've cultivated a community. You could put a post out and you could get the support you need. What are you doing to adjust to this current avalanche earthquake environment? I
mean, putting out calls to the community always feels to me like a trick you can do once, right? Like right. The need to shop small and shop local is not new, and it's not changing anytime soon. We actually need a steady flow of traffic, not a one-time influx. And that's not going to change. That is what keeps shops in your neighborhood that you want to be there. We are still seeing a slowdown. We're down from last year. I do want to emphasize that this is the whole economy, right? This is everything is in a little bit of a slowdown. That's where we are. But it's hard. You know, I definitely have debt I wish I didn't have. It feels precarious. You know, this is my whole livelihood. There's no backup. So it's stressful. And yeah, I was talking to my friend Dawn, who just opened a new shop in Chicago, and saying that, you know, of course, the healthy mental thing to do is dissociate your mental state from the financial performance of your business. And it's really easy to do that when things are going well. But when things are bad, like you feel it everywhere. You feel it in your leisure time. You feel it in your sleep schedule. You feel it. It's scary. So that's a thing. And mostly where we've been cutting at Books with Pictures is in staff hours. And I think that's only going to continue. I think that we're going to continue to see just the less ability to have staff in the slow season of Q1 of next year. my full-timer Nick is going to stay full-timer, but is going to have less coverage for other things. And then hopefully it'll pick up in the spring when it always picks up.
Right.
These things are cyclical. I am still hoping for a banger of a Christmas season. I think we're on track for that. But I think it's rough right now. It genuinely is. We do need people to keep buying from local shops. I think that the other thing is that when you look at the way that the pandemic exploded, the comic shops that are very, very dependent on collectibles had a huge boom. We had less of that boom at Books with Pictures because we're not a collectible shop. And so people buying speculator back issues for a great deal of money didn't shop with us. So we saw an uptick, but we didn't see an explosion. And so now we are seeing a downtick, but we're not seeing a cascade. Mm-hmm. And I am grateful that, Dogman is a steadier sales stream than, rare back issues. But also, I think that some of the sense of panic that is coming from other shops is coming from shops that are more dependent on, or that saw a bigger boom mid-pandemic and therefore are seeing a bigger crash.
Yeah, the drop-off feels more significant. I do think it's interesting, and not this is an entire aside. Now, we can't get into it because we have a 30-minute cap, but at the same time, I do think that to some degree, some of what we're seeing now was kind of starting to be seen in 2019, and then like the pandemic boom kind of papered over those troubles.
Yep.
And now it's like kind of a continuation of that. And as you're saying, it's like if you were one of those shops that was thriving because you had back issues and you had key comics, I'm doing quotes for people who can't see it, and all these different things that people were super desirous of during that stretch, you were up big. And like you said, like that drop off probably feels calamitous comparatively. It's like you're going from this extreme high to like next year, you're maybe back to where you were at 2019, but are you dropping off like 25% at that point? Maybe.
And we were worried in 2019. I also in 2019 was really concerned about the fact that Diamond changed our boxes. And I really, really hate the new boxes. Frankly, I still hate the new boxes. But every time I think about like Comics Pro 2019 was a huge deal for me. I filled a notebook of promotional things that I wanted to do. I was so inspired coming out of that meeting. And less than a month later, we were in lockdown. Mm-hmm. And so I look back at that notebook and I'm like, we still need these things. We still need an industry-wide promotional push from people who are not comics retailers for getting people to read single issue comic books for fun.
Absolutely.
Not as collectors, but as readers. We need, but we've needed this now for 5 years. And have been in survival mode on the tightrope for the last 3. And so, yeah, I think you're absolutely right that a lot of what we're doing now is normalizing, settling into a new set of challenges, a new set of expenses, a new distribution of distribution. That is awful. My theme for this year is a distribution of distribution needs. But a new set of challenges that are now the status quo, that are not going to go back to 2019, but the challenges of 2019 are still there.
And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. Looking for the right place to read digital comics? You can find it at Omnibus. Omnibus is a modern digital comic book store and reader app carrying your favorite single issues, volumes, and omnibuses, all day and date. It's just like a comic shop where you pay per book, but digital. Omnibus has even upped its game lately, as they've added a web reader and store on top of its iPad version, with iPhone and Android coming soon. Looking for an ideal digital comic store, but with an excellent shopping and reading experience? One that uses novel discovery features to help fans find their next new favorite book? And one that features many of the best comics and publishers in comics today, including publishers like Image, Boom, Dark Horse, and more? You can find all that on Omnibus. Visit the web store or download the app today at omnibus.app. And now, back to the show. All right, that was Katie Pryde from Portland, Oregon's Books with Pictures. And up next, we have Heidi MacDonald. I'm here with Heidi MacDonald from The Beat. Welcome to the show.
Hi, David. Good to be back.
So you're back because it is my three themes episode, and I tasked you with picking a theme or topic that defined comics in 2023 from your perspective, and you picked the broader world of comics marketing. What made that your pick?
Well, it's sort of inevitable that marketing is going to cross over to comic book journalism, which I've been on here talking about many times. But they do go hand in hand. And I think at the beginning of the year, I started talking about the comic book sales charts and the lack of same. And that definitely became a big topic all year. And here as we're closing out 23, unbelievable. I see people talking a lot about marketing and reach, and especially as Twitter has decayed. It's not even called Twitter anymore, and it's just decomposing in our very eyes, and we really relied on it. And a year ago we knew that it was going away, but now we're actually seeing the results of it. So I think your recent interview with James Tynion, also he talked, it was about marketing, and I read that and I thought there were some really salient points in there. And I just think that is going to be a big issue um, that people have been dealing with, but I think it'll become even more crucial to the industry moving forward. Because we're going through some tough times right now. Retailers are definitely struggling, and publishers are. It's a time of disruption. Publishers are struggling. Creators are wondering what's next, and we're definitely going through a big disruption. And at the end of the day, marketing is one of the big arms of how this whole ball of wax works.
I think it's interesting because marketing is this thing that is in support of all of this stuff, and yet I don't really feel like it really gets talked about as much as part of it. It's like it's easier to say comics aren't good, or it's easier to say that comics are too expensive, or this or that. But the thing is I think this is kind of something that touches on everything because we're in a time where there's more comics than ever. We're in a time where social media is decaying. We're in a time where, let's be honest, there's not like that super headliner comic site where everyone can go to and it's just got everything. And I say that as a person who runs their own site and is talking to a person who runs their own site. And it's just, there's all these elements that all tie into marketing. And even though I don't know if everyone is talking about the topic, it is the type of thing where I feel like there's a significant influence, even if you're not doing it. What do you think the biggest problems facing everyone who's trying to market comics right now is?
Well, I think it's just discoverability, and I think it's like going to a place and having an influencer, or thought leaders or a reliable source or authority. In the olden days, we'd go on, Rolling Stone, and we'd see what the new, or Spin, and see what the new albums coming out in the next week were. And then we'd back that up with a trip to Tower Records, and we'd walk around and, see what the new albums were. And it was, it was very gatekeepery, but it was also very reliable and authoritative. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
And, same thing with comics. There used to be, I think it was just easier to create a buzz about things. And, certainly I know it's not allowed to be spoken about, and I know that it was bad, but, the Warren Ellis Forum was a terrific place where people would talk about new things. Scott Pilgrim being a huge example that pretty much broke there, and everybody was like talking about what a great book it was. And, it would be a great book anyway, but it was easy to discover in those times when we had forums and message boards and, comic sites. There was 7 or 8 comic sites, and then bloggers would pick up the message. There'd be a discourse on blogs where people talked about things, and they were far more influential. Now obviously book talk became a huge thing in the book world and all over the last few years, and all publishers are really into book talk and the influencers there. And comics talk has not developed quite in the same way. I know there's manga talk. I know there's a lot of coverage of manga and anime on TikTok. But finding comics coverage there is still very difficult, and or it hasn't moved the needle yet. And I wonder why that is, since it's such a powerful, influential platform right now.
And it's a visual medium. I mean, it seems like it would fit really well.
Yeah. Look, I think one thing the last few years have taught us is that actual comics are still a niche industry.
Oh yeah.
Okay. They are not like video games or television, which is, or well, streaming. By television, I mean streaming as well as linear. But pretty much what you talk about at the water cooler. And I mean, I feel like movies are becoming niche in their own way, kind of a niche medium. But there will always be smaller um smaller medium unless it's Peanuts,
Right.
unless it's The Walking Dead, which of course became a TV show. But, there are comics that break through to become household names and universally beloved characters. Just look at the Thanksgiving Day parade and you will see them floating in balloon form. So, just in terms of marketing, I think comics are like indie music. I'm sure I've said that here on your podcast before, but it's really, who are those artists? And I think what you said about there not being a big central website is also like, who's the big central rising superstar? You know, like I mean, we know Daniel Warren Johnson has just ascended to, Godhead with Transformers, right?
Hmm.
And but who else? I mean, Rachel Smith, yes, Laura Olympus, absolutely. But trying to say, oh, here is this creator that I really want to follow, and up and comer. It's really hard to find those up and comers anymore.
I mean, it's hard to build excitement in anything, to be honest.
Yes,
It's
yes,
just, I mean, there's so many good comics, and I think that's part of the problem is like whether you are trying to find the next big star, or if you're trying to just tout the current star, or if you're just trying to, promote a single comic. There's just so much noise, and it's so difficult to get people excited about any number of things. I
yes.
mean, like, here's the thing, and this is like, I have no doubt that they're going to do just fine. But there is a new Ed Brubaker and Sean Phillips book coming out in 8 days, and I don't really feel like I feel like I used to feel like some sort of like conversation or anticipation because they're such a big duo and everything, and it doesn't really feel like there's much conversation going on. And granted, I literally just read Where the Body Was, the new book, yesterday, and I saw all the different things the Image is doing in the galley to promote the book, where they're talking to influencers and they're going out to like library associations and doing all this stuff like that, and I'm sure it's highly effective. I also think that's part of the problem with marketing stuff is like a lot of the things that publishers are doing is kind of unseen stuff. It isn't just like tweeting about it, or isn't just posting on Facebook or TikTok or whatever about it. It's reaching out to
Yeah.
booksellers. It's reaching out to comic shops directly and everything, trying to do that stuff. And that's why part of the comics marketing conversation is always so difficult. It's like the glacier where it's like we can see part of it, but there's also a lot of other stuff that's going on underneath that we're not really aware of.
Yeah, and I think a perfect example of that goes back to Transformers and the
Energon. Energon.
Energon. Energon? G
Energon.
before O is a hard G, but okay, if you say so. The Energon universe which is the biggest success story of 23. I think that's fair to say, right?
First English comics, yeah.
At least for periodical comics, absolutely. And they did an incredible job with it. They kept a secret for all but 3 days, and they talked about it a lot, how they went and talked to retailers and they said you can't reveal this, and retailers love to reveal things to Bleeding Cool.
Yes,
I mean,
they do.
that's just how things are. And for whatever, I truly believe that they picked a bunch of retailers who had a conscience, and they did not reveal it, or the retailer who normally just runs and can't resist. But they kept the secret, and it was very effective, and it was really wonderful. It was wonderful. I'm probably like you. I got the advanced copy, and I'm not a Transformers fan, but I was flipping through the pages and I'm like, huh, a giant robot, huh? All right. And then I was like, oh, was that a Transformer? And then I'm like, oh, that was cool. Wow. And then they did the big reveal. And, it had been broken on Bleeding Cool, but only on the Sunday before
Yes.
Wednesday. That qualifies as a true miracle in this day and age. And it was very effective.
But see, here's like the thing that I think is really smart about that is I know that they talked to a lot of retailers about that. And what I like to think happened is that the retailers recognized that there is value, especially in this oversaturated market, of something having an actual surprise to it.
I agree.
In a few days. Like if you find out like 3 months ahead of time that Void Rivals #1 is going to launch this new universe, by the time it comes out, you don't care. But if you find out on Monday morning that this comic that's coming out on Wednesday and it's going to be the launch of a new universe, you're like, I actually do care about that, and now I can act on it. And like that's always been one of the challenges with comics marketing is like, especially for single issues, how do you maintain or build excitement 3 months in advance and actually have that excitement still there so people act on it when it actually gets released?
And absolutely. That is a huge problem. I wrote a whole series of columns about this back in the day, like 20 years ago when I was writing for the Buyer's Guide. And, I just that same problem. It's, and it hasn't changed at all. That we have 2 cycles of marketing, and one is to retailers and then one is to the customers. And the one to the retailers, which is for FOC, which is like 2 months ahead of time, totally ruins the surprise for the customers who go into the store. And, and all of the discourse now about, the fake discourse going on.
You're going to have to be more specific. There's so many discourses and fake discourses going on.
Well, the fake discourse of comics dying,
Oh, sure.
Sorry, self-serving. But, one of the things people are talking about, and all the retailer columns that came out on Facebook and on ICV2, people do talk about the quality. And I think we talked about that last time I was on here, and about page rates, and how I think that's what I talked about last time we did the 3 topics, was the page rates being stagnant.
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And so I think, a lot of people have pointed to that as part of the reason for the stagnation of quality. And, I think the excitement over Daniel Warren Johnson on Transformers shows that there are still things that are going to excite us. And I think you're right. I think it's the times we live in more than anything that are mitigating against excitement or joy in life, or, simple pleasures.
We're constantly immersed in this stuff, and it's hard to be excited about something when you're immersed on it. I do want to say too, like one underrated, I think comics marketing has its issues, but one of the things that's really underrated about it is marketing budgets are not significant for comic publishers, if they exist at all. They do everything on a shoestring at best. And I'm not sure how they can adjust to that, but it definitely feels like previous approaches are not really working in the current environment, especially with with social media. Like, I think to some degree, some of this is, to put it probably uncharitably, a self-owned by publishers who became increasingly reliant on creators and their social media followings as a primary way of getting word out. And it's like when those things started kind of crumbling and they don't have budgets dedicated to this stuff anymore, it's like, how do you get the word out? There's not a lot of paths.
It's funny because I was rereading your interview with James, and there was a really great quote in there that I'll read. From James. First, social media took the audiences from all of those websites to put everyone in the central space, and then it stopped functioning as a central space. But then those sites have been devastated. It is this cycle, and he talked about that too, how publishers had really outsourced, the ongoing daily promotion to creators on Twitter. And then they kind of did Substack. There was the whole Substack experiment, which seems to have been successful in its own way as far as promotion goes, building an audience for individual creators. Certainly not as a comics publisher, but it funded that. So cool, really cool. Good going. So yeah, that's it. And we have too many channels to even, comprehend all of them. And, when I do see something kicking off on Twitter, or, usually it's Twitter or Facebook, and then I try to find the source of what kicked it off. It's so hard.
It's such a rabbit hole.
Because it could be 1,000 different things. And, if it's a YouTube video, well, I'm just not going to sit. And I watch my videos for Marvel Strike Force, and I'm not going to invest any other time in watching YouTube videos, That's my third theme,
Heidi MacDonald's obsession with Marvel Strike Force. It is like the most charming and random thing.
Well, you have to have some kind of hobby, and that hobby fits with my other interests. So, just comic books and holding a phone in my hand.
It's better than the Mets sometimes. I'll give it that.
Well, that's a whole different level, but of interaction.
Well, let's talk specifically about impact, because I think that's one of the tough things is it's really hard to say what the impact of the current state of comics marketing is, because it's like, I think a lot of people, I mean, it's hard for me as a person who works in marketing and who pays attention to this stuff to say what it really is, because I don't know the totality of it. But what do you think the broader impact of all these challenges is?
I mean, I think it's just that. I think it's hard. It's hard to find excitement. I think it's hard. And excitement builds excitement. And one of the things about the sales charts that I've brought up repeatedly is going back to when the New York Times stopped having their graphic novels bestseller list, which is pure snobbery on the part of the person who was running the book review section at the time. It was absolute pure snobbery. And publishers were very upset by it because number one, it gives you bragging rights. It gives people look at the list and say, oh, that was the number one book. Let me look at that. And also for their internal marketing departments, like when you say, oh, we had a New York Times bestseller, then they put it's unfair, but they put more resources behind it, right? So I think it's just the and again, I mean, I live in a fog of information all the time. So it's, there's definitely, trees that I might not see for the forest, and so that could also be mine. And, I'll say my staff, I have so many great writers at the beat, and I don't have anything to do with the review section, thank God, but they do their rundown and they do get more excited about stuff. So, it could also be my own sort of, overwhelmedness, I guess, just at kind of having to oversee the whole thing. But I think it does just drain some of the ability to say this is the cool new thing,
Yeah.
like this is what's really hot, and oh boy, things are going great. And, thank God we have, wow, this is a new look. And also, this is just how the industry moves forward. I mean, I go back to Scott Pilgrim, which is literally celebrating its 20th anniversary. But when that book came out, it was such a groundbreaking, series with a fresh new viewpoint. And I look forward to seeing what the new creator who creates, I keep saying this to everybody in this. I mean, it goes back to Mark Miller, and we should definitely talk about him because he was in the news today. But Frank Miller was 22 when he was on Daredevil. He was just a freaking kid. He was a kid. And Denny O'Neil said, this kid's got something. I want to see where it goes. And also, Daredevil sold like crap. So there was no risk in putting a 22-year-old kid on the book. Nowadays we haven't hit bottom yet in the risk taking. Nobody is just ready to say, fuck it, I'm gonna just try this and see what happens.
I want to get to that point, to be honest, because I think
I agree.
There's a lot of interesting things that can happen. I mean, like the one of the more interesting times in Marvel's history was coming off the bankruptcy, and they're like, what if we did this Marvel Knights thing? What if we did this Ultimate Universe thing? And neither of them were 100% hit rates, but those were things you could point to with comics marketing and say, hey, this is something new. This is something to try out. And success and excitement begets success and excitement. I do think that I'm not as hardcore about the sales charts thing. I love sales charts. But at the same time, I don't know if they solve all of the problems. But one thing I will say is having something where you can say the 10th most popular comic this month was, I don't know, Damn Them All, a Boom series. Then all of a sudden people are like, what am I missing? Why am I not reading that comic?
Exactly.
Or another thing that you and I both wrote about was Goodreads getting rid of its graphic novel category. Like having that, I'm not saying that this is the reason why Alice Oseman's Heartstopper is such a big hit, but I will say that once it won that first Goodreads award, community award, it felt like every year it got considerably more popular, and I think that didn't hurt. And it has having those things you can point to and say this comic is popular. We just don't have that, which is kind of insane.
Great. It certainly put Heartstoppers on my radar. I hadn't heard of it before. And that's the thing. There's always a ground level of hits that readers and listeners and viewers are making popular. And with the diaspora or the diffusion of social media now, it's harder to see those trends, I mean, since we don't have comics talk, it's a lot harder to see those trends, and having some kind of forum where those trends can sort of be codified is important. I will say I just went to speak at a class of SVA students. It was the business class, and I hadn't done it in a long time. I did it for the first time. I did it, used to do it before, but it was like 10 years difference. And I had a slideshow. I had to completely redo the slideshow. Nothing from 10 years ago was germane to these kids. Now, it was a very lively class, and I was actually super heartened. There was actually some periodical comics readers in there,
Oh,
and who were really passionate about it. And one of them, we were talking about how we miss JHU, the comic shop that it's in the neighborhood. And they're into webtoons and manga. That's what everybody reads, right? And I asked one of them, I said, what do how do you find new webtoons to read? And then she just pulls out their phone, and I was like, oh, well, here's the list of new webtoons that come out every week on webtoons. And it's like, everything that the comics industry moans and frets about is on webtoons. It has popularity charts. It has, money charts. It has discoverability algorithms. It has lists by genre. It has, if you like this, I'll like that. I mean, it's no wonder they're eating our lunch. They have everything that works in the world of 2023 and comics. And you know what, though? Their content there is is um is very repetitive, and the students talked about that as well. Like Izakai is kind of burned out right now, and they're very much aware of that. They're being played sometimes by these titles, and but at the same time, it's like romance novels. These are the biggest genre of all, and there's sort of a formula at the beginning where two people are single, and at the end of the novel, they're not single. And
it's Hallmark movies. There's comfort
yes.
in the regularity. I will say, have you ever signed up for an account on Webtoon?
I mean, not that I use. I probably have
Okay.
one, but I
Well,
haven't
the
used
the
it.
actual sign up process has basically a discoverability process where they calibrate recommendations based off of your interests, which is basically what a good comics retailer does. But I do want to say, or one question before we get into Mark Miller, because we have to do that before we go. It seems like it's partially comics marketing is kind of the theme for you, but it's also partially the lack of a message to use for comics marketing. Would you say that's fair?
I mean, yes, yes, but I just think it's a the channel, and how to get the message out there, and CBR has completely disintegrated. Newsarama is no more, and the beat doesn't do anything, and we just rise and rise and rise. So in some ways it's self-serving because it's all good for me. I mean, you'd be surprised. It actually looks like people are so desperate they might even advertise on a comic book website in 2024.
What?
Yeah, I know, right? But I truly do. The message that I'm getting from people is that they are, I don't want to use the word desperate, but they are keenly aware that they need different ways and to promote their titles, and advertising could be one of them, which is pretty groundbreaking for comics. So yeah, I think it's all that. I also think nature abhors a vacuum. I said this also. Things go cycle, cycle, cycle. Newsletters are dead. Then came Substack, and then they have definitely cooled off, but not gone away. People still like their newsletters. We sort of have seen the message board in terms of Discord and Reddit come back a little bit. One of the other things that you and James talked about is that how the newsletters had become this really kind of intimate way to connect with the creator. And then you mentioned Chip Zdarsky, and guess what? People like that. They like to read about other people. They really do. And that goes back to Jeannie. like the very first message boards. There was CompuServe, which is much more like Discord is, Discord is now, whereas Genie was more like Tumblr. It was a place where you had your own spot, and I think it then became what maybe LiveJournal. I think it morphed, Genie users morphed into LiveJournal users, but Neil Gaiman had a Genie topic, right? And he curated it and had all his friends and everything on there and built his brand. I mean, there is nobody who is a better amalgam of one of a kind talent, and one of a kind self-marketing brander than Neil Gaiman.
Okay, so where does Mark Miller fit in this? You said you want to bring up Mark Miller, and I was like, do your thing. What do you got?
I mean, it's just really, so today the news broke at dawn that the Miller World books were moving from Image to Dark Horse. And I just think that explains, Mark is a really great self-promoter. And I don't look down on people who do that, just because we're all hustling. We're all just trying to get through this. And, Mark is a creator. He has a solid body of work behind him. Some of it is really great, and some of it is not so great, but he's done it. And he's also got things that I don't like at all. And, he's problematic as hell. But I'm just going to say, you and I both have been, David and I, this is a big shocker, but David and I sometimes DM each other and talk about things. And everybody's been talking about Mark Miller for the last couple months, because all of a sudden on Twitter, he was just, resurrecting himself and the dying embers. He was like standing there beating the drums and talking about, oh, God, John, what if John Byrne did comics? I can do a Scottish accent because my name is MacDonald, by the way. And oh, I think it'd be great if they bought back all these old timer creators. Wouldn't that be great? And, putting, oh, you should get 50% royalties. Like, just throwing out everything out there, getting people talking about him.
Like, he knows how to lob a grenade and get his name in the news very, very well.
He does. He totally does. And I think he backed off from his totally bizarre political tweeting, which he had been doing for a long time, and into more like, oh, let me stride into the discourse and lob a grenade. And, now today they announced this kind of Miller
World's going to Dark Horse.
New program, new start, a new #1, starting all over with a new edition. And I'm sure he knew this was coming, and good for him. I say good for him just in terms of I'm stepping back and admiring just how he did it, because he did it so well. He got his name out there. Because honestly, David, do you think if we hadn't all been talking about Mark Miller and his, interesting ideas for this time, that if this news had just come out of nowhere, I was like, oh yeah, Mark Miller, whatever happened to him, right?
I think that the proof is in the fact that Brian Michael Bendis did the same thing, and it didn't generate nearly as much conversation.
Correct.
Jinx World moved over, and it's I say that with respect. I like Bendis' stuff a lot, and it's just it's not the same, because Miller is just a really good self-promoter. And to be honest, it's like in that very specific regard, I think people could learn from him.
Absolutely. And I mean, he did it. He's very much a unicorn. He did it as only Mark Miller could. But he played us all like a fiddle, and, well played. I will say this real quick, because I know we're running out of time, but I do think nature abhors a vacuum. And this is a wish. I'm not going to predict this, because God knows I've predicted other things. They don't come true. So I'm not ever going to, this is really just
people love predictions. It's good, great for the news cycle. Get it going.
All right. Well, I do think that everyone out there wants attention. Okay. You and me both want attention. Mark Miller wants attention. James Tynion, we all want attention. At the end of the day, that's Neil Gaiman wants attention. A lot of us, that's part of why we do this. Okay. In some way. I do think that thoughtful, well thought out takes on things that are not a tweet take, but have a more permanent form, i.e. blogging. I think there's a chance that blogging might come back in some form in 2024.
When you say blogging, what do you mean? Do I blog?
You do, but you have it in a different format. Okay, you do, but because you have a paywall, it's a subscription site, it's not quite the same as just getting, I call it the orange blogger
It's like a live
era.
journal.
Well, even before that, I mean, LiveJournal sort of was an offshoot of like some of these things that I'm talking about. But in the golden age of blogging, which was 20 years ago, 2002, 2006, 7, before social media came along, there was Blogger, and there was this orange template that Google had that was on Blogger, which is run by Google, and all of the voices of the time used that same template, like Graham McMillan, with Fanboy Rampage, and then Tegan O'Neill and Kevin Melrose. And there was all these voices of the time, and it became like the blogosphere. Oh, what did the blogosphere say today? And everybody would go and check out, and then there would be people complaining. But anyway, I mean, and I think people are looking for some substance now, and there might be some small resurgence of that. Otherwise, there will come a comics talk. That's what I believe. I think one of those two things will happen and become very important in 2024. That's my prediction.
My prediction, and I've been saying this for a while, creator websites are coming back. People are actually going to start rebuilding creator websites because they're necessary today. And you got to have a place where people can find you because, I mean, if everybody migrates to Blue Sky and they don't have DMs, how are you going to make those conversations happen? You got to find another way. And now, a quick word from one of our sponsors. It's the last month of the year, and Zoop is saving its best for last. Zoop is proud to be the home of the first ever Jack Kirby crowdfunding campaign. Stay tuned for the launch of Kirby and Wally Wood's Sky Masters of the Space Force, the complete Sunday strips. Also, there's still time to support the Conan the Barbarian Colossal Edition featuring the art of John Buscema, Gil Kane, Barry Windsor-Smith, and other legends. Head over to zoop.gg to support the live campaigns and sign up for the ones coming soon. It takes less than 30 seconds to create an account, and the e-commerce style checkout is easy and intuitive. Add multiple rewards and add-ons into your cart, provide some info during checkout, and you're done. No confusing additional steps in finalizing your pledge, and no post-campaign surveys. And of course, every creator appreciates your support. For creators looking to crowdfund your project, Zoop is currently open for submissions. Email them at hello@wearezoop.com to start a campaign. And now, back to the show. All right, that was the Beats' Heidi MacDonald. And to close us off, I have writer and artist Jamal Igle. Welcome to the show, Jamal.
Hi, Dave.
So this chat is going to focus on your theme for the year in comics from a creator/publisher perspective. And it's a very good one, even though I honestly have no idea exactly what it means, because it could be many things. It's the fear of the unknown.
Yes.
There are a lot of directions we could go in, but just to start, why was that your pick? And who do you think it's most reflective of?
Well, this is something that's been coming up a lot over the past few years. So the reason why I say fear of the unknown, and this has actually been something that I've been noticing for the past 5 or 6 years, actually, but it really seems like it's coming to a head recently for a lot of people, or at least they're starting to recognize this, is that we are in a moment of transformative space in terms of how comics are sold, how comics are distributed in particular, what sells and to whom, why some shops seem to be thriving and others seem to be floundering. And there's a lot of fear out there because no one can figure out what the magic formula might be in order to increase their sales, either on the publisher level or on a retailer level.
Yeah, I think that is absolutely true. I mean, to be honest, so the first person I have on this podcast is Katie Pryde from Portland, Oregon's Books with Pictures. We kind of talk about the idea that this is a year of transition to some degree. And I do think that it's interesting because while you could kind of point back to 2020 and the shutdown with Diamond and everything as the beginning of that, I really think it starts in more like 2019. In 2019 was where things really started kind of dropping off and things really started transitioning in a major way and people didn't really know what to do. And to some degree, I think the pandemic boom that made sales increase kind of covered up some of that and made people feel really good about it because they're like, oh, everything is selling and this is super easy again. And now it's just everything dropped off and we're back to the point of panic where it's what does tomorrow look like? What does the product I'm going to be carrying look like? You'll see people like Steve Anderson from Third Eye Comics doing really well because Steve Anderson is extremely flexible. He's really good at adjusting on the fly. He's doing all that stuff. Not everyone is. And That's a pretty scary moment.
Oh, no, absolutely. And I absolutely agree with you. I think your timeline also is pretty dead on. The pandemic, the boom that the pandemic created, put a lot of people, especially after, so many mass shutdowns and so many stores having to shutter locally and not knowing how to pivot to, strictly online, for example, or doing home delivery like some people were doing as well, or doing, outdoor pickups, finding ways to keep things moving. The false sense of normalcy that was created by the pandemic boom kind of fooled a lot of people into thinking that things were normal and getting better. But even the things that became safe products, like for example, manga was considered a safe product for a lot of retailers. So they started investing much more heavily in manga. But now even manga sales are dropping off. I think the last number I heard that there was like a 23% drop in manga sales, both in Japan and domestically. I think because and kind of the same thing happened with other media, because our attention wasn't divided by, day-to-day stuff, that we had nothing better to do than to read and watch television and play video games. So now we're getting back to the normal.
Yeah.
Or what the normal sales figures would be for certain books, what the normal regional sales for certain retailers would be. And because I think a lot of it also, to be honest, is that we already have the situation where a lot of local retailers, don't do any advertising promotion for their stores. So, because people were not going to work, the few retailers locally who were able to kind of like get around the COVID regulations and everything that were being imposed at the time, either having creating like open air markets so that people could do their shopping that way. If people were just kind of driving around with nothing to do and suddenly saw, oh, hey, there's this comic shop that's got this tent outside and they're actually selling stuff. Let me go and do that. So going back to the fear of the unknown, comic book sales traditionally, and in my research over the years, I've found this to be very, very true. There is a solid number for people who buy comics on a regular basis, on a monthly basis, somewhere around 100,000. Ultimately, this has been true actually since the 80s. The only times that this wasn't true was during the 90s boom, and during World War II, Vietnam, Cambodia. Anytime when people had to ship stuff overseas, they were shipping over care packages, that sort of thing. And the pandemic, we had a recent boom with the pandemic. But traditionally, comic sales for monthly periodical comics have always floated around 100,000 copies. I'm just regularly reading comics. This does not include bookstore sales. This does not include buying
Webtoon
clubs or anything. Webtoon, exactly.
So the 100,000 number, how does that tie into the fear of the unknown? Is it the idea is that constant has like an expectation of what comics look like? Or is it something else?
Well, I think that constant has an expectation, but I think that there's always this want to be able to sell more. And I think a lot of domestic publishers look at overseas sales, for example, and think that we should be having those kinds of sales here domestically. Especially for monthly comics. But monthly comics have never really had that kind of audience. It's not to say that there isn't an audience for comics. There's obviously an audience for comics. There's always going to continue to be an audience for comics. Graphic novels are still one of the fastest growing sectors of domestic publishing. But we don't have the infrastructure here that supports comics the same way that they're supported in France, for example, or Japan. I mean, in both France and Japan, they're subsidized by their respective governments. So it's not the same thing. Culturally, it's different. In France, for example, 50% of adults read bande dessinée.
Yeah.
The last Asterix volume that just came out recently sold like almost 1 million copies.
Right. And everybody was reading it too.
Yes, exactly. So we don't have that. We don't have that audience here, in the same way. It's a very fractured and very much more scattered audience here. And there's very clear delineations. We don't have multiple points really where you could like go from, a kid's version of Batman and easily transition into a more adult version of Batman. For example, the way that you do with like Star Wars.
Right.
There's multiple points of entry for Star Wars, or even for like the Marvel properties. There seems to be a much more concentrated effort by Disney and Disney Publishing to make that transition easier for families in particular. And it doesn't really translate to a lot of different publishers. So you have a lot of smaller publishers who want to have, just to survive, want to have would love to have like a minimum on their books of like maybe 10K per copy if they're doing single issue monthlies. That would offset the cost of producing the trade paperbacks that they need to get into the bookstore market. That's where the money is right now, is the bookstore market. So the fear of the unknown, because that forces comic book retailers who have been dealing mostly with the direct market to have to transition to a much more professional version of selling books for retail. That means having to learn how to work in a completely different environment for them, and having to curate their stores in a completely different way.
Who do you think this affects? Because it is interesting. It's like that boom, the pandemic boom affected a lot of different industries. Like, for example, I briefly got back into sports cards because I love sports cards growing up. And I was like, man, this is a lot of money. I can't do this anymore. But the thing about comics is there's still like, it still has its base. But this is like, in my mind, like, while comic shops are feeling this, creators are feeling this, marketers are feeling this, publishers are feeling this. Everybody's kind of feeling the fear of the unknown because it's like affecting it in so many different ways. And it's also, I think in a lot of ways, kind of holding back comics because that fear of the unknown is, I think, part of the reason why comics is having this kind of slow, painful transition into whatever it's going to become next.
Right.
Who do you think this affects, and like, how do you think it affects them in specific?
Well, I think you're right. I think it does affect everybody, but in different ways. With creators, it's a little bit different, I think, because there just seems to be sort of this feast or famine with creators. They're either doing really, really well, making a living, or they're doing it on the side.
Right.
They're doing it for love. The publishers, the smaller publishers, and there are a lot more small publishers than there are large publishers, and a lot of what we produce in comics really is the sort of like, the version of, I've got a barn, let's put on a show.
Yeah.
And hoping you can make it to Broadway.
It is interesting. It's like, it definitely manifests itself in different ways. But I do think one thing that's definitely coming true in this conversation is that this has been something that's been building. This has been, I suspected that would be the case because it's like, you don't really have fear of the unknown without like a transition being in there.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Why 2023? Why is that the theme for this year? Because is it just this year is the one where kind of all the chickens are coming to roost, and it's like all of the last few years have kind of like the boom has died back, and now everyone's really feeling it? Is that why it's the theme of the year for you?
Well, I think yes, but I think also it's been part of that slow transition that we were talking about. I would say even before 2019, because you started to see the bookstore market start to gain traction as far back as 2015. And it has been slowly encroaching on what comic book retailers consider to be their territory. A lot of comic book retailers don't have sales experience outside of working comic book retail. So they only know the direct market. And then, even then, a lot of them got into comics retail when it was only Dime. And there were no competition. You didn't have Lunar. You didn't have DC, or when DC BS becoming Lunar, you didn't have Penguin as a distributor. So now you have 3 major distributors, 2 of them handling the 2 largest companies in the industry, or the domestic industry. The third one, Diamond, just barely hanging on at this point. And I keep being proven wrong with Diamond. I keep predicting Diamond's death at various points, but the Jeppies seem to be able to hold on in the face of everything, which, God bless them.
I think it's their diversified business model. It's kind of like comic shops. It's like they don't just do comics anymore, and that's kind of helped them survive this.
I think so.
The 2023 part of it is interesting. It really is just kind of a timing. But I'm curious as to, so fear of the unknown, there is like this pervasive feeling. I think frankly, you can see it in the discourse about the conversation about comics a lot, because it's something that has become extremely adversarial in a very real way. But beyond the discourse, how do you think this impacts the comic industry? Like, do you think it's more of it just creates this nervous uncertainty, or do you think it manifests itself in a much more tangible way?
I think the want of creating more diverse ideas and stories and characters, and injecting them into a traditionally majority male white space has been something that has really sort of quietly wrangled a lot of people. And then, that discourse started to spill over into the product itself. So yes, there are people who are definitely going out of their way to try to create things that are controversial, or trying to purposely, and I think rightfully so in some cases, create things that are far more diverse than they have been previously. But that sort of thing always has a ricochet effect. It's sort of like whenever there's a change in political party, there's always a hard pivot back to a much more authoritarian way of thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that happens culturally, that happens politically, but that also happens creatively. People want to hang on to the things that make them feel good, the nostalgia of the things that they remember growing up on. And those two things can't really come together.
Right.
You can't have fundamental changes in how characters are depicted, how stories are written, how stories are drawn, the talent and I hate using the word aloud, but the talent that decide to enter the creative space and have this nostalgia for the way things were. The two things are antithetical.
Right. I do think it's interesting, though, because I think historically, if you look at periods of transition like the one we're in, where there's a lot of fear in the market, like let's look back to post Marvel bankruptcy and the distributor wars, the most dramatic phrase in the history of the direct market. If you look at that, it's like coming out of that, there was actually a lot of really interesting creative transitions. Like Marvel started doing Marvel Knights, and they did Ultimate. Image transitioned, I believe, Eric Stevenson kind of started coming up a bit there, but that was when Robert Kirkman came up and was swinging for the fences and everything with Walking Dead and Invincible. But even like if you look at something like the book market was born from a time where everyone was saying bang, boom, pow, comics aren't for kids anymore. And so there was this idea, it's like, oh, maybe they're for adults. And then 2006, what happened? Scholastic Graphics launched, and for a second launched, and the comic industry was never the same. And I do think it's interesting, though, to look at all this. And like, I do think that while there is a tendency of kind of swinging back in the way you're saying, I also think that there are, coming from low points, there's often creative high points, which can lead to a resurgence. But I do think it's not a coincidence. I don't think it's a coincidence. How about, let's say it with better English? I don't think it's a coincidence that the book market has really, really thrived during this time, because they've more fully embraced the type of products that people are looking for, which is stories that are more representative, stories that offer audiences something different than the usual flavors, the ones that have kind of grown and evolved and have not been afraid of the unknown. They've embraced the unknown. And I think that it's, you see the book market rise, and the direct market is kind of it's kind of plateaued-ish, let's say plateaued. And I think it's at least in part because it hasn't embraced the unknown. It's been kind of restricted by it. And I think that that's a major thing.
I am not going to argue with you. You're absolutely right. No, where are we right now? Right?
Yeah.
We've had this resurgence of superhero movies over the last 17 years that, depending on the character, it's either going to wax or wane. You're going to have something that's either super successful or something that isn't successful. And the stuff that isn't successful or I would say moderately successful. Because also you have to remember that the delivery system has changed. The window for a film in general to be in theaters is what? 45 days before it hits streaming.
Titanic was number one for like 30 weeks. Sorry, I know Titanic is an anomalous example, but
no, it's not. It's exactly. I mean, part of the reason the original Avatar did so well was because theaters were able to keep the print, in theaters for like 6 months or some nonsense like that.
Yeah.
That's why it made all its money. It didn't make it. I mean, Star Wars is a perfect example. Star Wars came out, was in theaters for what, like a year and a half, ultimately. Yeah. You don't really have that market anymore. These things have changed. One of the things that's changing is not just the bookstore market, but digital. As digital technology comes more and more to the fore, periodicals are not going to be, I feel like periodicals are not going to be in print at some point. It's all going to be digital. So we'll probably still have monthly comics and weekly comics, but it will be delivered digitally because the return on investment for print single issues just isn't there. It used to be that you could count on those to be sort of a loss leader to build towards a trade paperback for the bookstore market. But now I think that, one of the things that on the publisher end, the fear of the unknown is we had to invest all this money to build, this, 120-page story to get it into bookstores. But we are not going to make any money beforehand, which has been the traditional model of how we've been doing things since 1932. Right.
I mean, the funny thing is, I think that the fear of the unknown can actually be simplified. I think it's a fear of change.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you want to be all basic about it, but
fear of the unknown does sound a lot cooler, Jamal. Well, okay. So I think it's interesting because it's like, when you look at this, I think a lot of people know, I'm not saying that there's one right path, but I think a lot of people know that the things need to change for things to improve. Right. And a lot of the things that need to change are things that at least in the short term, might make things worse for them, but might make things better in the long term. How do you think this can be overcome? Like, is there a clear path in your mind, or is this something that we're just gonna have to go through growing pains and just see what happens as we come through it?
No, it's gonna suck. No, I'm complete. Look, change is always painful. Change in every industry is always painful. It was painful when video stores had to make the transition from tapes to DVDs and Blu-ray. It was painful when record stores had to get rid of vinyl and move over to CDs, and then all of those album stores closed down as everything started streaming. But now we're getting back to physical media again because the media companies keep taking everything away. So now you're having this resurgence in physical media, but we haven't even hit the peak in terms of physical media because nobody has really found the right thing. Like nobody's invented. Let me put it to you this way. No one has invented the right device yet to make a more comfortable transition to where physical media isn't taking up a lot of space in your home. And I think that's an issue for a lot of people, is that this stuff accumulates.
I'm gesturing to my entire room right now.
Exactly. You can't even see, like you were talking about, you started buying like sports cards during the pandemic. I started rebuying Kenner Superpowers figures from the 80s.
Oh my God.
Like, yeah, I
can see a Superman up there. So
yeah, that's the Hot Toys. I've got like a couple of Hot Toys Superman figures, but if I'll show you real quick.
I mean, it's true. I mean, I did a piece not that long ago where I interviewed readers about their view on the current environment and like kind of what their experiences are. And like one of the things that we don't really think about is the fact that like space, like the space of what you have available to put comics in is a real blocker for people.
Oh yeah.
It really impacts them. I do think though, I mean, I'm going to try not to insult the broader comic industry when I say this, but I think sometimes comics the comic industry looks itself as this special flower, like this one where everyone is fully unique and these problems only happen to us. And comics are so crazy, right?
Yeah.
There's a reason why we've referenced like 10 different industries while we're talking about this stuff. And it's because all this fear of the unknown, the fear of change, all these things are things that industries have been going through for the last like 10 to 15 years because things have been changing at such a rapid rate. And not necessarily even in a way that is financially or experientially better. It's just theoretically good. So why not do it? We've crumbled our own industry.
Right. Well, I'm going to disagree with you on one point though, which is there is a uniqueness to how comics are produced and marketed.
That's true.
At least here, we are a periodical product built on cult of personality, which is not something you really see in any other industry. Like our industry is built on these floppy things, and we try to build stars to sell more of these floppy things, depending on what company they go to and what characters they work on.
Yeah, that's true. That is a really key difference because the periodical nature and the cult of personality definitely makes it different. It's like some elements have cult of personality. It's like Taylor Swift has a cult of personality.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
She's not releasing monthly albums, much to the chagrin of the Swifties, I'm sure.
No, but Taylor Swift also isn't, Taylor Swift on this album and then goes and does like a rap album.
Yeah.
Only
Garth Brooks does that. I forgot what his other name was.
R.I.P. Chris Gaines.
Chris Gaines. Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because you're right. There are subtle differences, but do you think there's a path to like, to put it dramatically, but to work off of what we're talking about, a fearless future, like a place where everyone gets over this stuff, or is it just figure things out and then the next step will have its own fear of the unknown?
I think there is a path, but like I said, I think there's going to be growing pains as we adjust to it. A lot of it is, for my belief, a lot of it is technological. I think that as the migration across the board of print to digital for periodical product begins to happen, and that'll be precipitated by the creation of a digital device that is both inexpensive for a lot of people and has a satisfying viewing experience for a lot of people, which isn't the phone. The phones are very small, but it also has to have the cool factor as well, which is what a lot of tech products have, is that tech companies make the product cool. It has to be cool for you to own. That's why people argue about, Android versus Apple, when it comes to phone technology. So price point is a big part of it. It has to be relatively expensive where people feel comfortable, occasionally losing and replacing it. I always sort of likened it to back in the 80s when CD technology was first introduced. And then, a CD player started out at like $1,000, and eventually you could buy a CD player for like $20.
Yeah.
So I think that has a lot to do with it. But in terms of like content and delivery, we're going to move over to a primarily trade paperback market, OGN. It's inevitable. One of the things that manga has proven, and one of the things that First Second and Scholastic and Penguin and all these guys have proven, is that kids will read comics, and they will read long form comics if you give them a satisfying reading experience. You're not going to get that. The generations that the direct market were built off of, the people like me who went into the comic book shop every week, for years and years and years, that generation, like among younger readers, doesn't exist the same way.
All right, that's it for this week's special 3 Themes episode. I know it is a big change of pace, but it's a good way to begin my look at the year of comics, and I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Off Panel with retailer Katie Pryde, comics journalist Heidi MacDonald, and writer-artist Jamal Igle. You can find them at Portland's Books with Pictures, On the Beat, and Twitter, respectively. Love Off Panel, want to support it? Subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts today and give the show a rating or review while you're at it, but 5 stars only. You can also support the show by backing it on Patreon. Find the show at patreon.com/offpanel, and when you back it on there, you get early access to each week's podcast as well as weekly content and more. Want even more? Subscribe to my subscription comic site Sketched at sketch.com for long-form articles, interviews, and the rest of the site's content. You can find Off Panel and Sketched on social media by following on Twitter and Instagram at @sketchcomic or following me at @slicefriedgold. Big thanks to all my existing patrons, including Charlie Stickney, Danny Ollie, Tom Drennan, Jeremy Thomas Burke, Jared Schwab, Scott Dunn, Chip Mosher, Alan Ellsworth, Seth Pomeroy, James McEwen, Kenny Myers, Andrew Lehman, Christina Merkler, Scott Place, Darcy Van Polges, Travis Schmeiser, Tom Evans, Natalie Mockery, Reed Beeman, Kelly Sudaconic, Max Wood, Jeremy Lampert, Brian Hold, Chris Doré, Near Levy, Dennis Hoffman, Jason Hussa, Kieran Gillen, Jonathan Kent Uratam, Henry Johnson, Jingo Boren, James Tynan IV, Chris Langford, Jason Wood, Tom Peachy, Ben Domstead, Rom V, Nick Walker, Patrick Coyle, Isaac Oren, Scott Carpenter, Rent Narb Studios Comics, Capes and Tights Podcast, Klaus Vandeven, Brian, Submin Industries, Jack Mulqueen, Carl Kerschel, Robert Masella, Elza Chartier, Luke Nakashoji, Dr. Luke, Scott Hazelwood, Canadian by Proxy, Bradley Rader, Carl Troy, Brandon DePills, Patrick Brower, Declan Shelby, Dan Carino, Adam Freeman, Ben Wild, Brian Klein Q, Nick Bennett, Birdcage Comics Cafe, Susanna Polo, Reed Hinkley Barnes, Mario Tiambang, Andrew Carita, Matt Mahoney, Stephen Holt, Philip Myra, Chris Pachalo, Torrin Grunbeck, Fuzz Bubbles, Christopher Todd, Transmitter Down, Waltz Comics and Books, Akil Wilson, Alex Dimitriopoulos, Terry Dodson, Wesley Gipp, Sean Kirkham, Julio Anta, Brett A. Schmidt, Jason Goodmanson, Paul Reinwatt, Vita Ayala, Akil, Philip Seavey, Al Ewing, Ryan Alcock, David Kelly, Nick Polito, Matthew Groom, Jason Massey, Adam Bogart, Matthew Taylor, Nick Patera, Jacob Sorelli, Ford Gilmore, Dave Baraldi, Nick Hall, Bjorn Basin, John Hendricks, Steve Anderson, Ian Maxfield, Cliff Chang, Colin McMahon, Scott McGovern, Nathan Fairbairn, Adam Highfill, Fiona Staples, Mark Cabnet, Michael Shirley, Tom Barnett, Jim Demonakos, Norbert, Nick Lowe, James Kaplan, and Mission Comic Star in San Francisco. You guys are all the best. A quick thanks to Wolfpack for letting me use their song outro as the show's opening theme, and to Upright T-Rex Music, who wrote and performed Off Panel's outro and ad music just for the show. Check out their music on Spotify because it's completely delightful. Thanks for listening, and tune in next week for another episode.